Hello and welcome to Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers
by writers
to keep you writing.
I'm Marshall.
I'm Nick.
I'm Brent.
And I'm Will.
All right. So this episode, we actually have Phoebe Wagner with us. She was recently my editor for the anthology Fighting for the Future. So we are going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a little bit about some of Phoebe's work and what she has going on. And I'm actually really stoked to have her here with us today. So what we'll do is I'll just allow Phoebe to introduce herself and, give us a little bit about her work and what she's doing in the science fiction and fantasy field. So, Phoebe, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast, so this is a really fun experience. I'm Phoebe Wagner. I'm primarily known in science fiction and fantasy. I think as an editor first, I co-edited Sunvault stories of Solarpunk and eco-speculation in 2017, which I actually just found out crossed over 5,000 copies sold. Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about that. And that was sort of a first for the Solarpunk subgenre, which is where I primarily do a lot of my work. And it was sort of a general collection of poetry, fiction, and art for Solarpunk in English. And that just hadn't quite happened yet at 2017. It was sort of Sunvault was the first collection like that. My second edited collection was actually nonfiction, and it was a peer-reviewed academic collection, so something very different. But it has gone on to sort of help Solarpunk find its niche among academics, as well as just the nonfiction world in general. And then finally, my third anthology, which Brent was in, is Fighting for the Future, which is continuing or maybe more starting the conversation between cyberpunk and solarpunk. I've always just felt like there was a lot to say. But I'm also a fiction writer. I always thought of myself as a fiction writer first. And I teach creative writing at a small liberal arts college.
So, as you can tell, Phoebe's awesome. And fun fact before we dive into the anthology, it's because of Just Keep Writing that I actually ended up in an anthology in the first place. So, yeah.
I was so excited about the anthology or about Brent being on it and listening to the podcast. I was like, I want to see if Brent's available to do this. So, yeah.
Yeah. So there we go. So that's how that came to be. Yeah. I feel like I told y'all, but maybe I didn't. Yeah. So that's how I ended up in the anthology because
you did. You didn't happen to tell us that person is going to be interviewed with us as well.
Yeah.
Oh well, I think that came after the fact. So.
Well, that means a lot. I appreciate that. That is awesome. That's
right. Like opportunities like for collaboration coming out of the podcast is pretty cool. So on that note, I guess since we're talking about the anthology, maybe you want to tell us a bit about like Fighting for the Future and like how the idea for it like kind of first came into being.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of unique in that really Android Press approached me about two projects, one which became my novella that came out in earlier this year, When We Hold Each Other Up. But Justine was also really interested in doing an anthology since that's primarily what I'm known for in Solarpunk. And they actually suggested this idea of a cyberpunk Solarpunk anthology. And I just like leapt on it immediately. Back when I did Sunvault, my co-editor and I felt that Solarpunk potentially had the legs to kind of maybe be like the next big sort of punk subgenre. And we just kind of gambled on that when we did that anthology. And since then, it's definitely one of the more popular ones at this point, I feel like. But I feel like Cyberpunk and Solarpunk never got to have that full conversation as much as I feel like Solarpunk is this sort of grandchild of Cyberpunk. So as soon as Justine suggested it, I was really stoked to dive right into it and start thinking about who I wanted on the cyberpunk side of things, especially because I think we're at this renaissance of cyberpunk where things are changing and there's a chance to reform the subgenre. And so I was really excited to play like a tiny part in that and get some exciting people involved.
Yeah, no, that was I when you said like cyberpunk, when you approached me with it, I was like, yes. I had never written cyberpunk, so I wasn't sure if I could, pull it off. But yeah, I was super excited for the reasons you were talking about, like how there is that conversation that's happening, especially with us dealing with climate change and everything that's like sort of in the background of all this stuff now. So like I was super stoked when you first told me about it. So I've been on the editing side before too, and I think I always feel like I come out of it with like lessons like that I kind of carry with me and like really, really good experiences too. So when you were doing this anthology, like what was some of your biggest lessons? And then we can talk about your best experiences too when editing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like every time I do an anthology, I think, oh, I'm going to be like more detail oriented. I'm going to be more organized. And then every time I never feel like I'm detail oriented or organized enough each time I do this. So I think for me, like that was my third time coming out of this. I'm like, man, I still have not achieved the level of organization that I want. But I think one of the joys though, and this has been my experience for every sort of collection I've worked on at this point, is like seeing what people submit, like just kind of what shows up in the submission box is so amazing and so cool. And I love having the vision of an anthology. Like that's, I think, where my strongest skills lay is sort of the vision, getting that out there, getting people involved. And so to see that come to fruition through what just shows up in the inbox is really cool. One of my favorite things is one author who, I'm going to have to pull up the name real fast. Christopher Moscato. One of the things I loved was receiving that story in my inbox, which is Cloud9 in the collection, because Christopher, in the email after I had accepted it, was like, Sunvault was my first experience with Solarpunk, so getting to submit and then be published in this is like so cool. So that was like very touching for me and very cool. And it's a great story. I mean, all the stories are great in this, but that's a really fun one. So.
Oh, yeah, that's a great experience because it's kind of like you're seeing like, you're building these bricks and people are like kind of like, wanting to contribute to the stuff that you're building. I haven't edited an anthology yet, but I just feel like it's one of those things I want to do at some point for some of the reasons you're talking about, like just getting to see like what these multiple talented people end up creating and bringing to your vision and kind of like enhancing and uplifting it. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like I feel like I really try to come in really open-minded too, where I have like certain ideas that I know like, okay, in Solarpunk stories I look for this, with the Cyberpunk stories I'm looking for this, but at the same time I just like want to open it up too, because I never know what's going to surprise me and what's going to sort of just pop up that I had no idea, or two stories that just immediately like, oh, there's a connection here. Like these stories need to be back to back in this anthology, things like that.
Right. Okay, so I will go off script a little bit here. Then, so like with the Cyberpunk and the Solarpunk, like what kind of things were you like when you started the anthology and before you even approached anyone? Like, what were some of the things you were like kind of hoping would pop up, either like thematically or like concept wise or whatever?
For the Solarpunk, I'm always looking for this mix of like stories that are a little bit in the farther future, but also stories that could be happening like 5 years from now. And like the stories that are happening 5 years from now are usually very rare to show up in like the inbox. That's been my experience, at least. Like I kind of have to go search out for those. So whenever I like have something like that show up, I'm like super excited. And so that's something I'm always looking for that I don't always like see immediately. And so whenever it happens, I'm excited. But for Cyberpunk, I was really concerned that there was going to be too much of a focus on like the individual, because we see so much of that in the Cyberpunk, the sort of, noir detective figure that's going off on their own. And so I was really excited when that wasn't the case. And I had these brilliant stories that were focused in on community and being able to sort of focus in on that and let that be the driving force of a lot of the Cyberpunk stories, which of course perfectly leads into what Solarpunk is all about. So I was very excited that that felt like such a natural through line. I wasn't forcing that.
That's such a perfect segue into I think what will probably be like the meat and potatoes of this episode. So I want to give the disclaimer before we get into it to all of my fellow contributors to the anthology. We're going to talk about me and Izzy's story, but it is in no way, any shape or form, any slight to anyone else in the anthology. It's just a matter of like time, and the guys would never let me live it down if I didn't let them talk about my story too. So I had to accept that.
We like to embarrass you.
Yeah, and Izzy was a previous guest too, so it just kind of made sense. So yeah, so fellow anthology people, trust me, I love your work too. We just got to consider like time constraints and whatnot. So, okay, with that disclaimer out the way. Okay, so with Izzy's story, Do Anarchists Dream of Collective Sheep? It kind of shares a lot in common with my story, Nano Vibration, in regards to community kind of being the foundation of revolution. So, Was this a theme that you purposely sought out for this anthology? And if you did, or even if you didn't, why do you think it's important?
Yes, I mean, community is always important to whatever I'm working on. So it certainly was something that I was hoping was going to show up, but it was really getting both of those stories where I was like, now this section's starting to come together in my head. So it was like seeing both of those and having those. And they were like, and like thinking about how they were going to be placed were ones, because those are important stories in the sense that I knew other stories would kind of fit around them. So I kind of always had that in my head when I got both of your stories. I was like, okay, these are sort of pillars of this section, and they'll open up space for other stories to be about community, and then to lead into the transitional stories, which would come after the cyberpunk section. So yes, like I hoped it was kind of like, this is a best case scenario that these are the stories that I would get. But I mean, well, Brent, you would know from the emails and stuff, I was very open-ended. I was like, you do what you want. Like I will figure it out from there, because I was really trusting, I was excited to work with you and Izzy. I met Izzy back in 2018 and just followed her work for years. And so I was thrilled to get a chance to work with Izzy. And thrilled to get a chance to work with you as well. And so it was exciting just to sort of just like give you that creative play. And then I would get to put the puzzle pieces together on the other side.
Yeah. So I will tell you, when I first got that table of contents and saw my story first, I freaked out. Like I was texting the guys and I was like, oh my God, like I'm first. I was like, this is so much pressure. Because I'm like, oh, like the first story is like in the anthology, I feel like is like, that's like key placement, because that's going to be the thing that like for a lot of people either like sells them on it or makes them put it back. And so they can tell you I freaked out. I was like, oh my God, like what? I was like I trust Phoebe, but at the same time, like I'm also like I don't know if this is right.
No, so like I was one of the reasons I did that, because yeah, you're right, I put a whole bunch of pressure on your one story. but I was really, I think for the exact reason that you said, like if someone didn't like that story and felt really like turned off by it, or it just wasn't for them, they weren't the right audience, then probably the rest of the stories weren't going to be a good fit either. And I particularly loved how you were pushing the envelope with like the idea of rave music, with how, with drug culture, and like how you were playing around with that. I was like, this is important. It's important that we be having this conversation in stories, particularly I think for cyberpunk stories. And so I felt that having you first with how your story ended up being like the focus, as well as the community orientation, I was like, this is the audience that I'm looking for. Like if someone likes this story, they're going to like other stories.
Yeah. Well, I people can't see me, but I'm smiling really hard because that means a lot to me. So, Marshall, I saw you had your hand up, so I'll let you.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think you're right. It does. I mean, and I haven't gotten to read all the stories in this anthology yet, but I think going first, Brent, I hear you. I know that it's a tone setting kind of thing as well, and it's like, okay. And like Phoebe said, if people can't vibe with this, they may not vibe with the rest, but I've heard you talk about this before, like, and I'm waiting for it. Like I'm reading the story to, and I'm like, okay, he did say something about raves. He said something about drugs and stuff. So how's he going to do this? And when it started to come together, I was like, oh, this is insanely cool. So I love the community aspect, but can you just talk about, and I'm turning the interview to you a little bit. Can you just talk about the kind of, not so much the inspiration behind the story, because, but at the same time, like why you wanted to focus on this as a source of revolution, partying and the drug scene and kind of thing.
So, okay, so it kind of ties into like when Phoebe first reached out to me and was like, I want you to be a part of this. I kind of felt like, and this kind of just speaks to her reputation, I'm like, I have to step it up a little bit. Like I need this story to say something, because I feel like with Sunvolt and, and Solarpunk in general, it's like we're in a really pivotal moment as a species. Like, we gotta figure some shit out, or we may not be around for long. And so I kind of felt like if I'm going to be part of an anthology like this, I want to say something that feels true to me, but still at the same time also is kind of like speaking to that larger message of like, we need to come together and figure some shit out. And so for me, I guess in like the past, I'd say maybe 2-3 years almost, I kind of like I kind of fell into a rave culture a little bit, and the thing that like made me fall in love with it had zero. Well, not gonna say zero, but not as much to do with the music as it was with the spirit of the people there. Like the I go there, and I go to these parties, I go to these raves, I go to these things, and I'm not saying it's a perfect community, but nine times out of 10, it feels like I go there and everyone's smiling, everyone's hugging each other. You see so much love. You see people who are like, you see people who aren't ashamed of their bodies. Like you see people who like, because they know they're not going to get judged. You see like queer people just being openly queer and they don't care. They'll be right next to some dude who looks like he walked right out of like a Hollister ad, and that guy won't care. It's like, it's just like this idea of like, you just come as you are and you're accepted as you are. And the only real rule is like, don't be a jerk. and I kind of saw that, and obviously, like, no one's stupid. Part of raves is the drug culture too. That's a part of it. And even before I was in that scene, I always had this idea that like, I just fundamentally hated this idea of like how we frame drugs as bad and people that do them as bad, and people who are addicted to them as like less than. And I always hated that even before I got into the scene. But once I got into the scene, I really saw that. I'm like, I'll be honest with y'all. The group of people I see who pound the most drugs back and party the hardest are doctors and nurses. And without a doubt, and I mean, I was just at a rave last weekend actually, and that we met a group of nurses, and these women party harder than anyone else. They were drinking everybody under the table. And so it's like these people that in their day jobs would hopefully be respected, they come out and they just cut loose and they have a great time. And they're no less a nurse, they're no less a doctor, they're no less a professional for the fact that they do drugs or they drink. So I've always, it just kind of solidified for me that idea of like, okay, let's stop. Let's change our conversation about drug use and how that plays into like our moral judgments of people. And then I was kind of thinking too, I'm like, well, what if drugs were like a delivery system for like, information? I wanted to make it something cool.
That's
like
so
I was
cool.
like, it gotta be cyberpunky, right? And part of the reason I thought like, well, these kind of people would be the best people to do that stuff is because they're disregarded. They're looked down on, like no one looks at a crowd. Well, I can say no one, but certain people won't look at a crowd of ravers and go, oh yeah, these look like some well-educated, responsible adults here. They're not thinking that, So yeah, so that was kind of my like whole impetus. All of that kind of like rolled together into like, okay, well, let me tell a story and let me actually show the side of this community that I see. Because in most media, I see it, it's like, this is some deep, stark, scary shit, and this is where all the drug dealers come, and this is where the heroes come when they want to like whoop some ass and find the villain. Like, I didn't realize how much it mattered to me until I saw the latest Batman movie, and it just pissed me off, that one scene in the techno club. I'm like, you've never actually been to a real techno club, have you? Like, that scene was just so, so I was just like, honestly, that movie probably like rebuking that scene probably was a big part of this story too. So yeah, I hope that answered your question, Marshall. I kind of went on for a while.
No, and actually I have a quick little follow up to that, because I think what you're saying is spot on, but like you also have that moment with Han or however you say it in the book.
Oh yeah, Han.
Han with the full on, how the characters react with an addict and how so what was your I think the story would have worked just fine, I think, without that character. But having that moment, can you explain why you decided to include that?
Yes, because I mean, yeah, y'all guys know I had an ex who was an addict. I've had friends who are addicts. We also see people on the scene who we know probably need to slow down, probably need to like reevaluate, probably need to. And we see people who are on that road, and we try to like do our best to steer them from it. And me and my friends, we've all had the conversation with each other where we're like, hey, if any of us ever see each other slipping, we need to pull each other back.
Yeah.
And but I guess why I felt the need to include that was just because, so many people, that no one's becoming an addict because they think it's fun. No one goes down that path because they're like, oh yeah, this looks like a great time. Let me just ruin everything that I have around me for this one substance, and I just kind of wanted to I guess maybe show a better way of looking at people who suffer with addiction, and maybe it's like I said in the story, maybe it's not a perfect solution, but you can be compassionate. You can try your best to be compassionate. You can try your best to see their humanity first, and and go from there, and also too, and the reason I did that, it kind of just makes me think of like bigger conversation about like how whenever someone shows compassion for a person, well, why don't you take them into your house? Or, well, if you care about them so much, why don't you? So all of those kind of conversations were in my head when I wrote that scene. I wanted to hopefully show what felt like a real moment, and I was afraid as I was writing it that like I might have been chastising the people too much. So I don't know if I succeeded, but I wanted to try to make it like a real moment where like it didn't feel like I was being too preachy. So I don't know.
No, I think the balance is there. Sorry, go ahead, Phoebe.
No, one of the things I loved about the story was I think it does bring that nuance, and it's important, I think, when we're thinking about punk subgenres, that there is the punk side of things, right? That there is that, sort of joyful nihilism, but also that punk is caring for other people and caring for your community. And I think that just comes through, both sides of that come through so clearly in this story. Plus there's the music element, which I think was just so fun to see in like a cyberpunk story for me.
Yeah. And to kind of like, I guess, to provide some real life context for that particular section too. So there's a party organizer here in San Diego. When he does his underground parties in these different like locations, a lot of times it's homeless people who help him find the location. And so what he does is that he gives them a percentage of the profits. Like, you help me find it, you get a percentage of the profits.
Oh,
and yeah. And so that's one of those things where it's like, you're showing us where we can go and party, and like, but at the same time, I want to make sure you're taken care of as best as I can take care of. He can't give the guy a home. He can't, fix whatever their situation is, but at least he can do that. And that's kind of what I drew on to when I created that little snippet.
That's awesome. Nick?
Okay. So I have questions for Phoebe. Brent, I could talk about your stories all day long. But Phoebe, I'm really curious, with Brent headlining being the first story here, that sets a strong precedence for what the theme's going to be for the rest of the series. How did you go about, because I'm very curious on like structuring an anthology and like doing one myself one day, right? How did you go about selecting stories and deciding the order in which you wanted to lay them out? Is there like a heavy hitter on the back end that we don't know about yet that we should know about?
Yeah, I think I love like doing the structure is one of my favorite parts for sure. Like just like playing around with the order and seeing how things are, how themes are going to sort of bounce between stories. So yeah, I definitely love that part. And I think, I actually really followed what we did with Sunvault, what my co-editor and I did for that one when I went solo on this book, which I put a quieter story as the last story. But I think it's also a very like strong story. Like it's not ending on this like sort of heavy-handed note, like climactic note, but The Holiness of Light by Cynthia Zhang is just a really lovely story, but it's very quiet. But it's also one of the stories, like I said earlier, that feels like it could be happening 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And so to sort of end the collection on that story felt important to me because I wanted to keep things very present in that final moment, but also just to sort of end on this smaller community-driven story set in California, and that was involving wildfires. I lived in Reno, Nevada, before I moved to Pennsylvania, where I am now, and so the wildfire situation was something totally new to me as being someone from more of the East Coast side of the U.S., and it made climate change feel so present in a way that I was not used to. And so yeah, I think thinking about balance, like Brent's story is very loud in a different way. And this story is very quiet, but they're both thinking about community resilience and how people come together. They both have these like great punk aspects to them. But ultimately sort of end on this sort of hopeful community aspect. And so that was kind of how I bookended everything. But in between, there's sort of these stories that end up just being like these heavy hitters. Like Izzy's story was another one in terms of how I think about pillars. Like, I guess that's kind of how I think about it in my head. It's like, okay, this is a major note I want to hit. Here's another major note I want to hit. And then in between are these stories that help build like these moments and help establish the themes even more. And so Izzy and Brent's was one that I was like, those were two in the cyberpunk section, mainly because they're hitting on my favorite sort of punk aspects, particularly with cyberpunk. And the title of Izzy's was great. Like I could not have, when I saw the title, I was like, yes, like, this is amazing.
It was so cool. I was like so bold of her to be like, to take such a classic title and be like, I'm going to make it my own. And just, yeah, that story, like what it did with, I actually found that story very profound because I really thought it was going downhill. I really was like, oh, these people are going to rip each other apart by the end of it. And the fact that like, despite their own memories being tinkered with, they still were able to come back to what, you know what? We're still going to ride together and we're still going to fuck shit up and we're still going to fight. Like, we're still going to fight the power. And I thought that was like, when I got to the end of it, I just kind of like sighed a little bit. I was like, wow, like that was really, really well done.
Yeah. And I loved how it played with form and how it thought about like personalities within community. Yeah. That was one that gave me room to move. Like once I had that story, I was like, okay, now I've gotten some of the themes out of the way that I'm really adamant I must have in this section. And then I got to feel like I could play around a little bit more. So yeah, right. that was exciting.
All right, Nick, I see you.
So I just want to know to see if anyone else caught this, or maybe it's me overthinking. I don't know. Izzy's story is written like a programming code. Yep. So I caught that and I was like, oh, this is genius because you can tell each stanza builds on itself. And when there's an error, there's an error. Like it's visibly displayed and stuff like that through conflict. And it's a very, very smart technique. And I love that.
So smart. Like the way that like Izzy was able to, it felt almost like, and I mean this as like a super huge compliment. It felt like that one of those Ghost in the Shell intros, like when that old anime used to come on. Yeah, like it. I felt like I was like I could just see it, and it was so. And the crazy part is, it was so visual without much visuals. Like there wasn't really like huge descriptions of these anarchists, but like they still were like very vivid in my head. So yeah, Izzy really, really, really did a great job with that.
Well, Nick, I'm glad you brought up about the code because that was something that I think you can't have a cyberpunk portion of Anthology without having some of those aspects. And so like Izzy's story came up and I was like, okay, good, check, got at least one that's really heavy handed on that. But then I also love Tomorrow is Another Day by Lewis Evans for that very reason, because having them back to back, I feel like people are already primed with Izzy's story to then go into that one, which also has like heavy coding emphasis. I don't know if anyone got to that story.
I actually am on that one now, so it's funny you say that. Yeah, because like I follow Lewis and we've had a couple of conversations online, so I was like, oh yeah, I definitely want to like check out his. So yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, so it was fun to have those and be able to be like put them back to back and let that theme sort of keep growing. So that was one of those, because Lewis came in through the inbox, just like came in and I started reading the story and I was like, oh, here we go, this is great. So.
Yeah, well, and that so that kind of makes me think of a question too. So when you think about like soliciting writers before you take in the input, so like what kind of, for you at least, what kind of goes into like the solicitation of a writer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's a couple different things. Like first and foremost, it's like usually people who I'm like really excited to work with, like people that I'm like, this would be very cool to just get a chance to talk with them. And also I kind of usually have tiers, right? Where, you obviously want someone who's going to be a little bit bigger of a name. And so that ended up being Cory Doctorow for us. And I was super excited to have a piece reprint from him. But then it's also like people that I want to work with. And then also I try and find people who are a little bit earlier in their career or maybe haven't published a lot recently, because I just think like a solicitation is just like, it just feels really great to have that, particularly earlier in a career, or if you've been on pause or just haven't had something come out in a bit. So I try to like run the gamut a little bit, because I think it is like really powerful to get to solicit people who are early in their career, but and then have them in the table of contents next to someone that is more established. And that's just a really exciting thing to get to do, and something I'm always feel like very happy to do as an editor. And it's just fun then to see like the different types of creativity that end up being sandwiched together. So that's some of the things that I think about. But like, honestly, a lot of it is driven by like, who do I want to kind of work with right now? Like, who would be cool? Who do I think is available? You know, you always end up soliciting probably twice as many people as end up there, because, you know, people aren't available, or someone just had a solicitation go out and they can't do this one. So that's why it's usually like, who do I want to work with, and knowing full well that, we'll see how the list gets winnowed down.
That makes me feel even more good about it. Cause when I got it, I was like, I was like, oh, I'm getting solicited. Like, wow, that's cool. Like, yeah, no, I was stoked. And I don't think the feeling ever goes away, because like the anthology I just got solicited for, can't talk about it yet, but soon. I felt the same way. I was like, oh, me? Like, really? You want me? But yeah, no, that's I appreciate though that there is like some thoughtfulness behind it too, not just in terms, because I mean, we're not gonna say names, but there's definitely editors out there who I feel like they only ever approach these same people over and over and over.
You're in such a powerful position to give someone else a boost. Like, that's why I'm always interested in like, and that's something I was thoughtful of with the Solarpunk section of this anthology, is as much as I loved with some of the people I got to work with on Sunvault and wrote like the more highly regarded pieces that ended up being in that anthology. I was like, I just really want to bring new people in. Like, Solarpunk, I think, really benefits from having fresh voices. And so I really wanted to just bring in new people, get a chance to work with new people, and go from there. So yeah, I think that's really, I just think that's important. Every editor should use their ability wisely when it comes to that. It's a powerful position to boost someone's career.
Yeah, 10,000% agree. Well, I saw Will. You got want to hop in?
Sure. So Phoebe, I have a question for you. When you're editing and like you're soliciting people to create a story, like they haven't sent it to you yet, and you get it, are there times when you're reading it and going through the editing process that you're like, the idea is here, it's a part of the anthology, then how do you go back and say, but it's not quite there yet? So how do you have that conversation with the writer, like about that, so it fits your vision of the anthology?
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of cheat on this one by saying that I've been super lucky. I haven't really had that happen yet. Not to like a really like major degree where I felt like I had to like ask for a serious rewrite. So I don't, that's one of those bridges that I'm like nervous for when it happens, because I just feel like it's a really hard position to be in. People, they've already, writers already invested a lot of time in this story. As an editor, I don't know how many revisions they've already gone through, or if they haven't gone through a lot of revisions and they're like looking for that feedback. And so I haven't had to deal with that too much, which I'm really grateful for. And sometimes it's tweaks. Like, I'll ask for well, what if you like push this scene a little bit farther? Like, Brent, I think that was one of the like little pieces I did for you, is I was like, well, this scene here, I think, what if we push this a little farther and see what happens? And that's really all I've had to do. So I'm very grateful for that I've just had these stories come into a place where I'm really excited about them. But also like slightly like, every time I'm holding my breath, I'm like, what if this is the story that I'm going to, where we're going to have to sit down and be like, hey, like, I think we need to do some heavier edits on this story. So yeah, I don't know. I know that's not a great answer, Will, for a good question, but that's what I got.
No, that works. I mean, that's great that you didn't really have to do that yet. So that's good.
Yeah, just listening to him ask a question made me nervous. I'm like, I'm not even in the situation. Oh my God.
Right?
Like, I wouldn't even know what I would do. I guess, I don't know, actually. That would be a really tough position to be in, I think.
I think the difference is if you're asking people to submit a story, as opposed to just opening up to anybody that sends one in. Like, you can send a rejection, right? And say like, oh, this is not going to fit. But it's another thing to ask a bunch of authors to do a thing and then being like, oh, this isn't how do I talk to this person? And I'm sorry I cut you off, Phoebe.
Well, and let's credit you too, Phoebe. Like, you're clearly having clear communication on what you want and what you're looking for too. Like, that's what speaks more to me. If you're not having a huge rewrite issue with authors, like, it just feels like you have clear and concise communication with what you want, what you're looking for.
I think it helps too that Solarpunk is so specific and Cyberpunk so specific too, that if someone's sitting down to like write in either of those subgenres, there's certain like expectations, right? And the people that I do like solicit, I'm like, okay, they're either familiar with Solarpunk or Cyberpunk, or I'm like confident in their ability. Like Brent, like I knew you hadn't really written in either subgenre, but I was like, what you write about, I felt very confident that whichever you chose to do, I was like, Brent can do a good job with this. And same with Izzy. I'd seen more punk work from Izzy, but I don't think I'd seen anything. No, Izzy had done some cyberpunk for sure. So I knew a little bit there. So I was thinking of like, will these writers be a good fit for these subgenres, and are they going to have the level of familiarity or be willing to just like jump in and try something? And so that's part of it too, I think.
Good, Will.
So was it hard to get someone like Cory Doctorow or like a name so you can like anchor the anthology? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, so there was a short list that I had of people, and every time I sit out to do a Solarpunk anthology, I'm always like, maybe this is the one. Maybe this is the one Cory Doctorow will take an interest in. And it turned out this was the one that Cory Doctorow was interested in, because, of course, Walk Away is one of those novels that a lot of people will bring up in conversation about Solarpunk, even though it's not labeled as Solarpunk. And so I knew he had and I knew he had most likely heard of the subgenre and maybe even played around with it. And then his story is it feels very Solarpunk, even if he didn't necessarily sit down to write it that way exclusively. So I think we were just lucky in that. But yeah, it's there's just also just authors that are larger names that would be interested in working with, like Nalo Hopkinson. I've asked her every anthology. I end up asking her, and so that's just another one. So yeah, just a couple of different names that you always hope for, and sometimes the publisher has connections. I know Android Press had a line on, I think, N.K. Jemison's people, like on N.K. Jemison's agent, and so of course you just ask, and you just hope maybe something will happen, but of course not, because N.K. Jemison is busy, But so that's part of it too, is you just start tossing those lines out and see what happens.
Yeah, well, I can say for my part, to Nick's point, I felt very clear on like what I was like, kind of the parameters I had to operate in, and so I did feel like, okay, I know and then for me too, some people have heard me rant about this. I'm like, raving is Cyberpunk already. I can already like, this is like easy shoe in. So yeah, so I definitely felt like it was easy to kind of like write the story. I guess I didn't feel like I didn't know what direction to go in.
Perfect. That's the hope.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I have lots of questions, Phoebe, for you.
Please.
So I want to talk about like the numbers of an anthology, right? Like you have all these amazing writers to your anthology. Like, what is the process of then marketing it and then making sure as much as you can that it does well and support like things like that? Like, does that go through your head when you're like putting an anthology together, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, and like I feel like I was so lucky with Sunval that my co-editor and I, like, we ended up at a press that like Joanne Miriam at Upper Rubber Boot Books had some anthologies with like really big names. And so she was really familiar with how to give it the best start it could. And so she did a lot of that on her end. And then, one day I go to Goodreads and it's got like over 300 ratings. And I'm like, when did this happen? Like what even, it wasn't me. How did this happen? And so I think now I do work like this. I think about names that are sort of in the sort of zeitgeist. Like one person who once again showed up in the inbox was Ai Zhang, and that was right when everything was just so exploding in her career. And so I immediately like jumped on that story and was like, this is someone that I think we need to have in the anthology. And so that was one of the first contracts I actually sent out, just because she had sent something else into the inbox and it got pulled because someone else wanted it. And so the second story came in. I was like, all right, this one. So some of it's thinking about who's turning in quality work that is also sort of like in the moment, and hope that boosts sales. So that way everyone can have their story enjoyed. And then it's honestly just, I think it comes down to vision as well, and like trying to have this idea that's going to stick in people's heads. Cyberpunk has always kind of stuck around, and so I think tagging Solarpunk with Cyberpunk for the third anthology hopefully helps that stick around so everyone can kind of have their stories further enjoyed. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really comes down to like doing what I can in terms of just doing promotion, finding those people whose names who want to be involved in the anthology, and then just kind of hoping that things work out. Because you can never really know how things are going to turn, who's going to take an interest in it, if there's a major review that comes out. And so some of it just comes up to chance. And I'm also finding the longer I do the writing stuff that I feel like I'm really bad at the marketing stuff. I don't know how you all feel about all of those things, but it is just so hard. And so I'm always just trying things and seeing what sticks.
Go ahead, Brent.
I hate marketing with a passion. It's so terrible. It's the worst. Like it because the thing about marketing, I mean, I do it for my day job, sort of. And the thing that like all of us know is that like there are no answers in marketing. No one actually knows what works and what doesn't. You're really, for the most part, just throwing a lot of shit at the wall and hoping some of it actually sticks. But yeah, so no, that was my rant about marketing.
Well, that makes me feel better. So,
Yeah.
Nick?
So, follow-up question to a couple things here. I'm curious to know, as a new writer who may not have anything published, how do they get on someone's radar for an anthology? What are the best ways to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think some of it's definitely, and this I think might be a little close to where I sit also as an editor. Like I'm interested in people who are like sort of good community members for science fiction and fantasy. And like, but I think that's like very much like me as an editor and also like the type of work that I'm trying to create. So I'm not sure if this is great advice overall, but yeah, but for me, it's definitely like when I see someone who's being like a really good community member, who's engaged, who's uplifting other voices, like even if they haven't had a lot of work published, then I feel very confident, like moving forward, if they were to, if I decided to solicit them as someone to like try and like bring, like, give them that sort of moment and like, get them a paid story, because I feel confident that they're going to be willing to work with me and that they'll also work with the other people in the table of contents, whether that's, helping out with the Kickstarter, or just, posting stuff on whatever we decide to ultimately go after Twitter, moments like that. I feel like this person's going to invest time in this, which is great. It's something you hope from everyone, that everyone's at least willing to post, a picture holding the book, and things like that. So I think for me, that's like definitely where I sit, is that someone who's a good community member, that makes me excited and want to work with them, and have that moment with them. So
I love that answer.
Before we get out of here, I definitely want to give Phoebe a chance to talk about her novella from Android Press. So it's called When We Hold Each Other Up. So if you want, tell us a little bit about it. And, do you think at all that writing this novella kind of informed how you edited the anthology at all?
Yeah, thank you so much. I love my little novella so much. So When We Hold Each Other Up is about is set about 200 years-ish in the future. It's sort of this solarpunk-ish, climate fiction-ish piece of work, and it's about Rowan, who is a teenager in the novella, and Rowan is really wants to be a storyteller, and Rowan is sort of living this nomadic life because that's the life that Rowan thinks is the most sort of like sustainable for what Rowan wants to do with with career and things like that. And as part of this, Rowan realizes that the city that is kind of near their found family is expanding, and that the city has sort of this negative aspect to it. And Rowan goes on to warn other people in the area about this expanding city, which is not a great summary of the novella, but I always have struggled to summarize this. I think the fun thing, though, is that as part of this, the characters, the people that Rowan end up traveling with, they end up meeting 3 other communities throughout the book. And each one was sort of my idea of different Solarpunk variations on how people could live sort of in just relationship with the rest of the living world. So there's like these people that live on the river and sort of like have this like nomadic lifestyle, but they're very connected to water and to moving through the water and cleaning up the water as they go. There's a group called the Archivists that are very, very traditional solar punk. Like they have like the dome city and the solar panels and all those kind of things. And they are very adamant about like networking knowledge and making knowledge totally accessible to everyone. And that's their sort of thing. And then there's this place called Open Gates, which is an industrial prison complex that was then taken over and is now this sort of sustainable city. Then they're trying to work through the generational trauma with the land as well as the people. And those are the multiple communities that kind of get explored throughout the book. So that's my little novella that I love from Android Press. And yeah, it totally impacted. Or Will, did you have a question? I will stop there.
Oh, I can wait until you want to finish your thought.
No, because I was going to talk about the anthology. So
no, let's talk about your novella. So that is so amazing that you thought about these 3 different communities. Like it's very nuanced. So my question is, how did you do that in a novella? It seems like a lot of juggling. Were you planning on it to be like a novel at first? Or were you always like kind of dead set, like, no, I can do this in a novella? Because to me, that is talent right there.
Yeah, you know, I didn't think when I kind of came up with the idea originally, I felt that it was going to be, I was like, there's not enough for a novel. And then I started writing it. I was like, that was a lie. There was enough for a novel. It was something that came down to time, like just where I was with the day job as I was finishing my PhD and I was a tenure track professor. And it was just, I knew I couldn't dive into a novel. Like a novella just has a different mindset for me. And so there was part of that. But with coming up with the ideas, I really wanted to play with the old writing advice that, and there are 2 types of stories, right? A stranger comes to town or someone goes on a journey. And I wanted to try and like combine them. So that was part of it, as part of this journey where they're going and they're going on this quest, right? But at the same time, they keep being the stranger that comes to town. And so that was like sort of how I worked through the different communities, was I had this like story structure I wanted to play around with and just like kind of have fun with.
When you think of the future and you're imagining something 200 years in the future, are you trying, because we're talking a lot, I feel like in science fiction and fantasy, about like late stage capitalism and getting over that. So are you trying to envision like a better way to do things so that it starts discussion, or are you working things out at the same time of like what the possibilities are? Like, where does this come from?
Yeah, it's definitely trying to imagine these better worlds. Like this, like so many of the communities that get visited throughout the book are like very queer normative. It's queer normative world building. It's anti-capitalist. Like these communities are for the most part not using capital. And there's more a section where I talk more about capitalism, but that's in a different part of the book. But generally, these are communities that have moved away from that very purposefully. And this is kind of several generations after that shift. And it's like, how does these communities start to function then? Like, what does it look like when the people that are living here don't remember that? And that's not part of their day-to-day life. And that was a fun part actually with writing the main character, Rowan, is there were certain words I went back and like word search to make sure I hadn't used like spent, like just like casually saying like, oh, they spent the day doing X, Y, and Z, just like trying to remove those words that have that more capitalist language influence. So trying to push back on that, like, what does it look like a few generations after we've switched into a more sustainable and just and socially just world?
So I'm fascinated with this, the way that you just described it. Do you feel like it was hard to rewire your brain to not use like capitalist terms?
Oh yeah, definitely. And I'm sure someone's going to read this book and be like, wow, like she didn't do a very good job. But there's definitely moments where there's definitely like certain words that I knew because I try to edit them out of my regular language, and like try to change how I think about it. And so there's certain words I need to go look for. And that's something that I want to get better at as I keep imagining these different futures is more fully separating those characters from the worldview, right? Because that's the great struggle of writing from where we are now while trying to imagine this better future is like, how do we do that? Like my mindset is fully influenced by colonialism, capitalism, white supremacy. So like, how do I like rip that apart and then be able to write something that's forward looking in a way that's useful and helpful? And like, that's something that I love wrestling with every time I sit down to write these types of stories.
That's amazing. I could ask you more questions, Phoebe, but I'm going to stop because we'll be
I'll
here
give
all
you
night.
one more if you want, but I want to kick it back to Brent to make sure we've covered everything too. So where are we at?
We have definitely covered everything and more, and like this has been really fun. I warned Phoebe in advance we would go off on tangents, so it's totally fine.
We always
That's
do.
great. I was ready. I knew.
Well, I can't thank you enough for hanging out with us. I know because of the tech problems, we've kept you over time a little bit. But I just want to give you a second. We have one more question that I'm going to have Brent ask. I just decided that Brent's going to ask it. But before we get to that last question, where can people find you? Social media wise, website, stuff like that. Android Press, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I'm at Phoebe Wagner.com. And that'd be probably the best place to get my social media too, because with poor marketing, I did not claim my social media handle at every place. So I usually am some variation of Phoebe's on different places. Probably I'm most active on TikTok right now, where I'm at Prof Phoebes. But you can find all that on my website. And Android Press, you can find them online at every major social media place. And you can also, that's where you can buy books and things like that. Fighting for the Future is available through Android Press's website, as well as being able to be ordered through any bookstore, anything like that. So hopefully you all will be inspired to check out Fighting for the Future and Brent's story first in the table of contents.
Oh, I can't wait for it to show up in my mailbox, even though I kind of have a digital copy currently. Again, thank you for being here. I'm going to throw it to Brent here in just a second, but we'll put all those links and everything in the show notes as well for people to buy the book and follow you. So Brent, I'm throwing it to you. Last question, buddy.
Okay, so last question. We always ask everybody this. As you are also a writer / editor, this is going to be appropriate. So what keeps you writing?
What keeps me writing is that as much as I work with a sort of positive forward-thinking genre like Solarpunk, like I am definitely scared a lot of the times by like the news, what's going on with climate change, politics. And so what keeps me writing is I force myself to imagine these better futures. And that's one of the things that makes me feel good as a person. And then sometimes I'm lucky enough to share that with the rest of the world. So keeps me writing is just imagining better futures and hoping they come to fruition someday. And thank you so much. I love the podcast, so this was a blast.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Thanks for coming. We had a blast.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.